Hankou, China, October 9, 1911. An explosion rocks the Russian concession in the city. The culprits of the bombing are soldiers who are members of the Tongmenghui, the Chinese Revolutionary Alliance. However, the explosion was not meant to go off this evening. So, with the police hot on their heels, these men decide to prematurely execute their plan for an uprising in the city. The next day, they go to their commander, Colonel Li Yuanhang, and with swords pointed at his neck, they demand that he'll lead the uprising. Li, while not a revolutionary, was neither a die-hard supporter of the imperial regime. Li first refused, but after some discussion and fearing for his own life, he finally acquiesced, and with this agreement, the Xinhai revolution had just begun. The revolution occurred during a period of great upheaval in China. And to understand the causes, we first have to roll back the clock a few decades. After the defeat against the British in the Opium War in 1842, the legitimacy and power of the Manchu rule in China had dwindled. The imperial regime was further threatened when it was almost toppled during the 1850s when the Taiping Rebellion threatened to destroy the Qing dynasty. Still, the Manchus managed to put down the rebellion due to several factors, not limited to the fact that the man leading the Taiping Rebellion claimed to be the spiritual brother of Jesus, and therefore was, perhaps at times, not the sanest and most competent leader. Both the domestic and external threats forced the Qing to attempt to reform and modernize the empire. However, as the century came to a close, the Qing were roundly defeated by the Japanese in 1895, and less than 5 years later, a reactionary movement known as the Boxers rose up, wanting to purge China from all Western influence. The uprising caused a multinational coalition led by all of the great powers to intervene in China. These events showed that the Qing had thus failed to stabilize the domestic situation, and neither had they managed to safeguard China from external threats. And when in 1908 the Dowager Empress Cixi and her nephew, the Emperor, both died in short succession, the throne passed to the 2-year-old Puyi, and the last semblance of central authority began to vanish. So, with the attempts of the Qing dynasty to modernize proven to have been fruitless by the turn of the 19th century, some groups, discontent with the imperial rule, began building a revolutionary movement intent on creating a republic to replace the regime. This revolutionary movement and other like-minded groups were therefore demanding radical reforms. What united them were mainly their anti-Manchu and anti-imperialist views, and they saw the Qing dynasty as incompetent and unable to defend China against outside aggression. The individuals who early on joined these movements, either reformist or revolutionary, were mainly those who had studied abroad, and one of those who had studied, both in Hong Kong and Hawaii, was the medical doctor Sun Yat-sen. Sun would become the leading figure of the revolutionary movement in southern China, and would attempt several uprisings in Guangdong aimed at removing imperial rule, all which however failed. In 1905, Sun created the Chinese Revolutionary Alliance, the same organization the soldiers in Hankou were a part of. The main political points of this movement was, quote, drive out the Manchu, restore Chinese rule, establish a republic, and equalize land rights. With this quote, the ideology of the alliance, and of Sun himself, can be understood as nationalist, anti-imperialist republican movement with a limited amount of socialism. It is important to realize that nationalist in this sense is not the same as the modern Western perspective on nationalism, where the ideology is seen as right-wing and isolationist. Sun Yat-sen, for example, was also a Pan-Asianist who wanted to implement a Western-style democratic government with left-wing social and economic policies. Sun Yat-sen exemplifies what has been described as the new elite in China, a group that mainly consisted of an intelligentsia educated abroad, but also merchants and capitalists. However, this group was still relatively small at the beginning of the 1900s, and could not alone heavily pressure the Qing. But by this period, it was not only the new elite who were dissatisfied with imperial rule. The old elite had also begun to become more outspoken in demanding more radical reform to the system. One prominent member of the old elite was Xinhai. Xinhai was a military man who by the start of the 20th century had become provincial governor in Chile, a province in northern China near Beijing, while at the time the city was called Peking. I will however use the name Beijing. In this position, he had also been given the task of the creation of a new modern armed force. The position he used to advise the Dowager Empress on reforms, even advocating for a constitutional monarchy in 1906. However, his loyalty toward the regime started to falter when he was promoted to Grand Counselor. While this seems like a reward for his strong loyalty, in practice it removed much of Yuan's power in Chile as well in the new army he had personally engineered. His massive influence was further reduced in 1909 when the Prince Regent forced him to retire due to a foot injury, while he had two very uninjured feet, meaning he was a de facto exile and perhaps would have spelled the end of his political career if not for the occurrence of the events in 1911. While the revolutionaries failed to foment a successful uprising in the first decade of the 1900s, the mounting pressure from the revolutionary risk and joint petitions from most of the provincial assemblies forced the imperial regime to act to regain the initiative. In order to placate these groups, a national assembly was created and a promise to convene a parliament in 1913 was made. However, this caused the group seeking constitutional reform to try to push even further, but these attempts were completely rejected by the Qing. This rejection inflamed the rhetoric of those who had previously been reformists and who by now started to demand, even through violence, a complete change in government. While the early attempts at a revolution had been small and therefore easily crushed, a new uprising with ever-growing revolutionary sentiment would have been much larger and therefore would have to be crushed with the new modern army that Qing had created to oppose foreign nations. However, this force was a revolutionary hotbed and not completely reliable. So, with the fear of losing total control of the situation, the imperial regime tried to dictate new initiatives. In May of 1911, a new cabinet was formed, whose members were a majority Manchu. Not only did this cabinet's clear Manchu dominance anger the non-Manchu Chinese, but it also replaced a minister who had been one of Yuan's friends, further antagonizing one of the more influential men in China. When this cabinet announced the nationalization of the Guangzhou-Hankou Railway, Hankou is today a city part of Wuhan, and the Sichuan-Hankou Railway, it came at the expense of local governments and populations. The regime therefore further alienated non-Manchu parts of China. This nationalization also set in motion a confrontation in Sichuan against the imperial regime by businessmen and members of the local provincial assembly who had invested in the railway. While it began as an economic conflict and anger about lacking compensation, it soon turned political as these business and assemblymen were frustrated with the regime's handling of things, which in turn made these groups demand increased local power and protection from the central authority in Beijing. They also began to demand other constitutional reforms for the whole of China. While some of these people were members of the Revolutionary Alliance, they remained a minority. In fact, most of these people were just reformists. However, the local governor of Sichuan incorrectly assumed that independence was the true hidden goal of this group. He therefore arrested the leaders and 9 others of the assembly. But instead of quelling opposition as the governor hoped, this act caused what usually happens when rash and misguided actions are made, the opposite. By the 7th of September, mass demonstrations and uprisings began in the whole of Sichuan. As September neared its end, the whole situation had delved into utter chaos, where neither the provincial leadership nor the opposition had control over the province. The turmoil in Sichuan therefore forced the imperial regime to act, and as a response, they ordered troops from the neighboring province of Hubei to move into Sichuan as reinforcements. However, this action would unknowingly seal the fate of the imperial regime, as large parts of these units were involved in a planned Revolutionary League uprising in October. So, when the leaders of this plot realized their plan would collapse if their soldiers were sent away, they rushed into action. And with this, the revolution had begun, and we are now back at the events of the video's introduction. So after the bombing, the soldiers of the revolution quickly took control of Hankou, and on October the 13th snuck into the nearby city of Hanyang and with minimal fighting occupied the military arsenal in the city. This arsenal would provide the revolution with much needed equipment, as they acquired more than 140 3-inch artillery pieces, and they also seized some 500,000 rounds of rifle ammunition. In the city of Wuchang, on the other side of the Yangtze, they also seized 5,000 rounds of ammunition for the 3-inch cannons and some additional 30 million rounds of rifle ammunition. The soldiers of the uprising now had enough equipment to be a serious threat for a long period of time. So with this military material, the revolutionaries took full control over the 3 cities. Soon after, the news of the events in Hubei spread far and wide, and many other regions in China joined the uprising, pledging their allegiance to the revolution. Since most of the pivotal combat of the Xinhai revolution occurred in Hubei, I will focus on this part of the conflict. However, there were fighting in many other Chinese provinces. In Hubei, the first clash between the revolutionaries and the forces loyal to the imperial regime happened on the 19th of October. This battle occurred at a train station north of Hankou that the literature I am using calls Kilometer 10, but the Wikipedia page for the Battle of Jiangxia, which this engagement is a part of, calls the train station Liujiamiao. This is not the only difference between the two. The Wikipedia page also says that the battle started on the 18th. I presume that the reason for the different naming is that Kilometer 10 is an English translation that was used at the time. However, I cannot find out which piece of information is the correct one, since I neither know Chinese nor is there much English literature about the fighting. So if you have any literature in English, please mention it in the comments. If any further information is conflicting, I will stick to the source about the fighting I am using, which, if you are interested, is China's Revolution 1911-1912, a historical and political record of the Civil War by Edwin Dingle. I will, however, use Wikipedia for the number of casualties, as this is not stated in the literature I'm using. Now back to the banks of the Yangtze. At Kilometer 10, the general of the loyalists in Hubei, Chang Piao, was heavily outnumbered and lost some 400 killed and 5,000 taken prisoner, which forced him to retreat further down the Yangtze. All was not lost for Chang though, as he waited with his 3,000 men for a gunboat armada under Admiral Sa, and some 20,000 reinforcements from the north under Jin Chang, a general who on October the 18th would be replaced with Yuan Shikai, who had been recalled from his forced retirement. Not only were the loyalists confident about the reinforcements, so were the revolutionaries, who believed that the soldiers would turn and join their side. However, this did not come to pass, as the loyalists put their loyal Manchu soldiers behind the men from Hebei and Shandong province to ensure that any possible mutiny was quickly suppressed. With his reinforcements, Chang Piao attacked with somewhere between 12 and 20,000 men on the 25th of October at a paper mill near Kilometer 10. At the start of the battle, the artillery of the loyalists fired short first, hitting the marshy ground in front of the revolutionaries. But soon the shells came crashing down on the poorly disciplined revolutionaries who began to rout. A war correspondent would write, quote, I found myself in the middle of a most disordered rabble of several hundred men, each doing as he liked. Some held their rifles high in the air, some pointed them onward at their fellows, others dragged them after them, and no one was there to give them orders. In this condition, the revolutionaries were unable to hold and had by the 27th completely lost Kilometer 10, suffering some 500 casualties. The loyalist forces tried to continue to push forward on the same day, but the revolutionaries were better entrenched, and on the 25th, the artillery of the imperial forces was still more accurate than those of the revolutionaries, and the revolutionary forces were slowly pushed back. The strongest blow came when the guns of Admiral Sa's river flotilla began firing on the revolutionaries. Under this heavy bombardment, they were forced to retreat to the city of Hankow itself. By the afternoon, the Imperial Army had reached the Japanese concession on the outskirts of the city, but these, being heavily guarded by foreign contingents, were bypassed as the army continued south. By the 1st of November, they reached Tachimen train station in the suburbs of the city. The loyalists planned to use their artillery as their main weapon. As one officer put it, "We have guns here that would blow these fellows into that great river, and if they don't give up soon, we're not going to leave a house standing." The imperial forces would fulfill this promise. The incessant shelling caused a massive fire to break out in Hankow, a city of 500,000 citizens. Civilians attempted to flee this firestorm, either into the foreign concessions, which they were refused entry into, or out into the countryside. Many of these fleeing civilians were shot or bayoneted when they tried to leave and failed to give satisfactory explanations to the soldiers of the Imperial Army. The city had turned into a bloodbath, drenched in the smell of burnt flesh, with 2/3 of the city burned to the ground. With these tactics, the Imperial forces were by the 3rd of November in full control of Hankow, and had reached the river Han, a tributary to the Yangtze. But this was not the decisive victory that Yuan Shikai had hoped for. The revolutionaries were battered, yes, but they had reorganized and become a more coherent fighting force after learning from the defeats near and in Hankow, and with reinforcements from Hunan they could alleviate some of the losses. Simultaneously, the imperial forces were losing control of more and more provinces in other parts of China, as seen on this map. And as long as Wushang held out, so would the revolution continue. Yuan therefore began to discuss terms with the leaders of the revolution, such as Li Yuanhang. The concessions discussed were not enough for the revolutionaries though. Li would state that terms would be discussed when the revolutionaries marched on Beijing, and they urged Yuan, who had by the 10th been appointed Prime Minister of China, to himself join the revolution, something which would put an end to the war, and if he did this, he would promise the post of provincial president of the new republic. Yuan refused and continued trying to push into Henyang, where the revolutionaries, now led by Kwang-Ching, held their ground. However, while Yuan continued fighting for the imperial forces, on the 12th of November, the ships under Admiral Sa had hoisted a new flag, the flag of the Republic. The few days after the battle, the front line remained in a stalemate, as heavy rain halted any major operations. Still, both sides continued to bombard each other with artillery. While Yuan Shikai were unable to attack Henyang head-on, he had sent a force of 3,000 men, led by General Wu, to cross the Han at Zaijian and attack Henyang from the west, a move which forced the revolutionaries to divert soldiers to counter that threat. So, by the 22nd, when the weather had cleared, the imperial forces were able to cross the Han directly from Hankow. However, the crossing didn't come easy. The Maxim machine guns of the revolutionaries killed and wounded hundreds of imperial forces each day. But the imperial forces would push on and force the revolutionaries to retreat, and soon they had captured the vile hill in the middle of Hanyang. By now, both soldiers and civilians began to flee across the Yangtze to Wuchang. Edwin Dingle would give this description to one of those boats that tried crossing the river. And there, when they were found, these 30, 40, 50 men were sitting huddled grimly together, their glassy eyes staring upward into the unknown. Mercilessly, with hideous brutality, they had been blown to atoms as they sat, and now were in the sitting posture dead, wedged in tightly one against the other. Some had fallen outward to the side of the boat, and their bodies now were hanging limply, swaying to and fro with the dull motion of the junk. Some, shot through the head, through the heart, through the limbs, had sunk exhausted to the bottom of the boat, where the water was fast rushing in through the splintered bulwarks, and lay face down in the water, drowned as they lay. By the 27th, Hanjiang had fallen. The imperial forces began their brutal retribution against Hanjiang and the nearby villages, killing the wounded revolutionary soldiers one by one. But like in all wars, the brunt of the violence was against the civilian populace. An elderly woman would describe how her 4 sons were shot on sight and that their wives had been taken away. But not only were the women taken away, but girls as young as 14 was forcefully taken, never to return. However, while the revolutionaries had lost Hanjiang, they had by the 2nd of December taken control of Nanjing. The revolutionaries were invigorated, but with winter setting in and the massive bloodshed, Li Yuanheng began to desire for peace. And both sides knew that while some provinces north of the Yangtze were in revolt, it was mainly provinces south of the river supporting the revolution. And without peace, the civil war would have further evolved into a north-south conflict. This was not the only pressing matter. Both sides worried that if the war dragged on, the great powers, especially Japan, would soon intervene, and all hope of China deciding their own destiny would then be lost. So 2 days later, both sides agreed on a 3-day truce, which was shortly extended by 15 days, and peace talks soon began in Shanghai on the 18th. Tang Chaoyi would represent the imperial forces, while Dr. Wu Tingfang the revolutionaries. The first discussions were about further extending the armistice to New Year's Day, which was agreed upon. The terms the revolutionaries then laid forward were that a republic, not led by the Manchus, were to be established. But if not led by the Manchu dynasty, it would most likely have meant a republic under the presidential leadership of Yuan Shikai, who one Chinese remarked wanted to be the Napoleon of China. Still, the peace talks went smoothly at first, but soon Yuan made it clear that he had the final say in any agreement made by Tang Chaoyi, which meant that Tang had lost any real ability to discuss terms, and peace talks broke down. However, at this moment, an actor, which I've previously mentioned, would finally make his appearance. Dr. Sun Yat-sen had finally returned to China. Sun would rally the revolutionaries around him, and during the first few days of 1912 he would be declared president of the newly formed Republic of China by the Provincial Military Assembly at Nanking. Shortly after, he was able to form an agreement with Yuan Shikai, where Yuan would ensure the abdication of the imperial family in Beijing in return for sharing power. This meant that the presidency of Sun was short-lived, as a part of the power-sharing agreement with Yuan was to relinquish the post to him. And by March 1912, Yuan was declared provincial president of the young republic. After ruling over 250 years, the Manchu dynasty was at an end, and the republic had come out ahead. However, the nation was still in a state of turmoil, and Sun and Yuan would soon come to clash with one another. The Xinhai revolution may have been over, but the fighting for the future and leadership of China was not, and would reach new levels of destruction and suffering, eventually being dragged into the cataclysm of the Second World War. A few notes about the sources before ending. This video really only uses 2. The Cambridge History of China for all the events prior to the revolution, and Edwin Jingle's account of the war. So it is important to note that this is not a truly comprehensive retelling of the revolution. Furthermore, Dingle as a source is not completely reliable for its accuracy. It is clearly marked by sentiments of the time period, as he makes several remarks about the essential nature of the Chinese. At one point, for example, he remarks that the soldiers of the revolution fought well and disciplined despite them being Chinese. So his retelling is by itself not really a source one would use in a professional setting. Thanks for watching.